everyone. My name is Marcia Greyeyes. I work for Change Labs. I am the director of the co-working space in Tuba City, Arizona. And we are normally open from 10 to 4, Monday through Friday. Last couple of weeks, we've been in isolation due to a COVID-19 scare. So we should be reopening on Tuesday. Just taking precautions. So today's webinar, we're going to be talking, or our presenter is Len Necefer, Dr. Len Necefer, and I will introduce him towards the end of talking a little bit about our program here. So Change Labs is located in northern Arizona. We are in Tuba City, and we do provide workspace and various other programs that go along with helping small businesses and business owners learn a little bit more about how to run their business. One of the questions that we get asked a lot is, how do I start a business? And for that reason, we have on Mondays from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. a business coaching session, which you can sign up for online by going to nativestartup.org/events. You'll see a list. Every Monday, we have a different business coach that does business coaching. So we have several slots open. If you wish to speak with a business coach, you can go on there and sign up for a time that works best for you. We also have a business incubator program where we take 10 small business owners or entrepreneurs or people that are starting their business to help them grow their business idea. Since I think we have about over 30 graduates currently, and we have a new group of business incubator members currently that are going through our program. How do I create a website is another question that we get a lot of. You can visit our YouTube channel called Change Labs. Please subscribe. On there, we have over 30 videos covering social media strategies and how to build a simple website. How do I get help running my business is another question that we get a lot of. We have a creative co-working space, which I had mentioned. We are located behind Denny's in Tuba City on the Moen Kopi side. We provide desk space, Wi-Fi, color printing, and various other gadgets to make buttons. We also host these monthly trainings, webinars, which you're a part of today. Our goal is to have a presenter bi-weekly, so that's part of the co-working space program. If you have any more questions, you can always email me at marcia@nativestartup.org. And for this presentation, when Dr. Necefer is speaking, please stay on mute until Q&A, or unless otherwise he wants a verbal response, you can always unmute yourself. Otherwise, you can type your questions in the chat. And this session is being recorded for YouTube, and it should be available on our YouTube channel within 48 to 72 hours. And here's some announcements. We are hiring for a community advocate, communications and brand manager. You can go to nativestartup.org/jobs. We'd love to hear from you. And if you know anybody that's interested in any of working for Change Labs, please direct them our way. Or if you're interested yourself, we welcome you to apply. And then join us next Thursday for how to legally protect your native artwork. It is going to be presented by ASU Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. And if you're an artist, this would be a very good opportunity for you to attend a webinar that might be helpful to you. And today's webinar is The Art of Digital Storytelling by Dr. Len Necefer. He's the CEO of Natives Outdoor, a Native American-owned outdoor apparel and media company. And their mission is they're working to empower Indigenous communities through their products as well as through storytelling for a sustainable world. And Len comes from a diverse background. He studied both engineering and public policy and spent more than half of his career in the energy sector and working on promoting sustainable initiatives on the Navajo Nation. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Len.
Awesome. Thank you, Marcia. It's really great to be presenting to my own people. It's been just COVID's definitely kind of changed the nature of our work, but it's definitely made coming home a little bit better, harder. But yeah, good to see you too, Kevin. Len Necefer of NativesOutdoors. Scottish Bushes Chindo Nakai Romanian Dashanale. My last name comes from my dad. He's second generation Romanian. I'm Navajo. My family's from the Red Valley, Arizona area. But my dad's from Detroit. And so that's kind of why I have that funny last name, but still have connects and roots over in that part of the world too. I've been on this journey since 2017, I think, is when we first incorporated in the state of Colorado. I filed the paperwork. I remember just doing it on my phone. It took about 5 minutes and about $5. And we incorporated as what's known as a benefits corporation. But basically that means that we are a for-profit business, but we have the added elements that we have a social and an environmental mission in addition to making money, which I think is important, and I think is a really key element of running a successful business, is having those social and environmental elements of the business. But it's been Change Labs came to me and said, "Hey, do you want to present about being an entrepreneur and what it's like to, have a successful business?" And I'm like, I would not define what we're doing as successful. I think we're kind of, it feels like we're riding explosion to explosion. It's very fits and starts. It's a lot of figuring things out, and we're still figuring things out in a big way. But I think the main thing that I've learned through this process is just persistence and just sticking to it, and also being willing to change and go a different direction than when we first started. There was a mention of apparel media or apparel. We're kind of getting out of the apparel business because COVID has really messed up a lot of supply chains, and there's not an end in sight for that. So if you're looking to buy gifts this holiday season, it might be a little hard because of that. But on the flip side, especially for on our end, it's meant that containers that get shipped across the ocean have gone from $2,000 to ship a big shipping container across the ocean to about $22,000. And so it's just meant that all of our prices have gone through the roof. So we've transitioned to doing more media, filmmaking, storytelling, that sort of thing. And it's a little different for sure. The barriers are different and higher, but we're trying to figure it out. But I'm going to share my screen. But one of the cool things I get to share with you is that I'll get to share a couple of our films and the projects that we've worked on in the past year. And I'll also get to share with you a ski film that we're working on too. It's actually we're saying it's the first native made and focused ski film. Great. Well, I'm just gonna go through a little bit of this. I think we have till 11:30, 12:30, whatever time zone you're in. So an hour and a half, hour and 15 from now. Does that sound right? Okay. Well, I'm gonna assume it's right. But just so you know, all the photos that are in these are from projects that we've taken, some of our personal ones. This is a peak outside of Moab. It's called, I think in English it's called Tuki Venevats or something, the La Salle Mountains. In Navajo it's Zithashlai, but it's an incredible mountain. We skied there for a film, but I'll share that in the link later. But just some of my background, how did I end up doing this? I just learned to climb and ski about 4 years ago, 4 years ago now. In large part, I was living in Colorado. I had just finished my graduate work at Carnegie Mellon. My research looked at the ways in which cultural values can inform energy policy. And I did a lot of work. My whole focus was on my home, Navajo Nation. And so I got to, I got to interview a lot of folks and talk with a lot of folks, and it was an incredible experience. But one of the things that came out of that work was I began to see how we carry what I say are sort of cultural software. Every culture has its own sort of software and how we relate to the environment. And I found a lot of interest in figuring out what's that intersection there between Native communities, non-Native communities, and others that on these places that we care about. And I really like spending time outside. And so eventually I started trying to figure out how I could get out of the office and spend more time outside, which, my grandpa said was our first classroom. And so I'm still trying to figure that out now, but I'll share a little bit of that journey is. I've written academic articles for my doctoral work, but I think the important thing to note is that this whole process of going through the PhD to learn how to communicate these really complex ideas in very simple and also just very short, concise ways was, I think, really important to how sort of my entry point into making movies, writing complex, op-eds and different sorts of things like that. It was basically how do you communicate these complex ideas in a way that's approachable is always a challenge. But I think in terms of then how to do storytelling, if you can figure that out, it can go a long way in making the stories that you tell approachable and understandable, and also motivate people on whatever call to action you want to include in your film, if that's part of it. But what spurred this for me was, why am I focusing on the environment? Why am I focused on the outdoors? Is because I grew up in a place, Red Valley, Arizona, Cove area, but this is an area that's filled with a lot of the legacies of uranium mining, which many of you are familiar with. My family's ranch, where we grew up, is where that white X is, and then all those red dots on there are abandoned mines. And my Che was one of these miners that was in there. He was incredibly sick, and right in our backyard as well, we had coal power plants and oil and gas operations that often led to a haze and a pollution being created, air pollution being created year round. And I would get sick a lot. And I remember being, as I went through my education and learning about this, it motivated me to want to make a change. And so that's kind of what led me down that path. But I'm going to kind of fast forward into, I went to graduate school. I worked for the Department of Energy. I worked with tribes on doing sustainable energy. At the time, 2016 rolls around, I was working for the U.S. Department of Energy, and an election happened. We all are aware of what happened, but one of the things is that policy priorities change when administrations changes. And so our office went from focusing on renewable energy and climate change to basically, I was asked to delete the word climate change from all of our websites. And that just didn't feel right. And I was looking for a way out, and I was looking for something to do. So I started this company, not really knowing what we would do. I said, we'll do apparel. We'll start on social media. And then what this led up to was, at the time, there was this whole fight by the 5 tribes to create the Bears Ears National Monument, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But this was also an opening on the outdoor industry side, because on the outdoor industry side, we're thinking of the Patagonia North Faces, the skiing, the climbers, that sort of thing. There's not very many there at the time. There was not very many people, Native people, in that industry, and I saw an opportunity there. There wasn't a Native voice and Native perspective there, and I said, here's an opportunity and opening to make that change. And an important thing to note is that much of the outdoor industry today relies on what we call federal public lands. These are things like U.S. Forest Service lands, Bureau of Land Management. These are all sort of the public lands outside of reservations. So when you go camp in the forest, that's U.S. federal public lands. But one of the things that was, in my work and study was just learning that, of course, all of these were the result of displacement and, in some cases, the genocide of Native peoples to basically acquire these lands. This has always kind of been in the back of my mind in sort of thinking about this work as well, is that the outdoor industry in many regards relies on federal public lands in order to be a profitable industry. And why aren't there more Native people in that space? I think the one piece of history that I always keep in mind about how recent and proximate and how close this history is when, historians basically call the last Indian War was 1924. Some Chiricahua Apaches were accused of cattle rustling, but it led to the U.S. cavalry being called and that sort of thing. 1924 was also when I believe my grandparents were about 2 and 3 years old at the time. So, within their lifetime, these things were still occurring. But when we look at the creation of these federal public lands in the broader outdoor world and in the United States, Teddy Roosevelt is often, he was the president in the early 1900s, but he was also credited for the creation of what we know as our public lands and conservation system today. But one of the things I always point out about Teddy Roosevelt and on his right on that photo, John Muir, is that they also were products of their time. They believed certain things about Native peoples that we look back as today. There's probably still people that believe this today as well, but also, he had this sentiment in when he was creating, things like the Antiquities Act, which I'll talk about in a second, but in understanding that this is in many ways the formation of our system today. In the Bears Ears region, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but, artifact theft is something that's been going on for over 100 years. Universities, museums, private collectors have created an industry in which, many of the artifacts of our ancestors are effectively looted and stolen for sale on the private market. But back about 120 years ago, at the turn of the century, late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a explosive industry or explosive growth in this industry. And many of these federal public lands were being looted, grave robbed in many instances. And so there was a big push by Teddy Roosevelt, believe it or not, is that, in Teddy Roosevelt's eyes, he saw the protection of these artifacts in these federal public lands as protecting the heritage and sort of the public trust of the United States. This was not to protect, Indian artifacts for the Indians. This was to protect sort of the artifacts that were then belonged to the United States in his eyes. But I think the important thing to note is that history is complex. So we look back at this Antiquities Act. So what is the Antiquities Act? What is it? How does it operate? Basically, the high level is that this is a power given by Congress to the president to basically protect large swaths of land that it would take Congress too long otherwise to do. And so that's been used to create what we now know as national monuments. So Bears Ears National Monument was created using this Antiquities Act. I think the big takeaway here is that as part of this, the 5 tribes of the Intertribal Coalition came together, of course, to protect our shared heritage and our shared cultural resources in this area. I always laughed when, I've been working a lot with the Ute tribes recently, and, my grandfather, my Che, would roll over in his grave if he found out how much we're working together. But, we, in many regards, the greater good was set aside. The differences were set aside for the greater good of protecting this area together. So this was in the news recently, but this monument was created at the end of President Obama's term. It was reduced under President Trump. When it was reduced, I left. I left the Department of Energy, and I decided to go fully in the outdoor industry and figure out how I could work to protect this area. But one of the first things I got involved with was basically fundraising for an education center that's now in Bluff, Utah, that you can go visit. And I'm also working alongside the Intertribal Coalition today on developing an Indigenous Knowledge Center there as well. But the important thing to note is that this was sort of an act that this was Native and non-Native folks working together to protect this area. And we believe that it was important that people get educated. And so we raised about $500,000 to pull this together. So I was living in Denver at the time, and one of the big things that happens in Colorado and in Utah was this thing of the Outdoor Retailer Show. It's a large trade show that brings about 40,000 people, 50,000 people to now Denver each year. But at the time in Salt Lake, it's a few close to $100 million in spending. It's a huge economic driver in this part of the state, but a number of retailers, Patagonia, REI, and a few others, said, we're not going to be participating in this because of the state's position on public lands and how they're treating tribes. And so they decided to pull the show out of Utah and put it up for bid. And at the time, I was working with the state of Colorado in their outdoor rec office. And we said, hey, here's an opportunity to bring this very profitable show to Colorado, but also we can use this as an opportunity to engage with tribes on how we proceed and work together on outdoor rec issues on federal public lands in places like the state of Colorado. So my company, along with the Recreation Office and the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, which is under the Lieutenant Governor's office, we pulled together a summit of 27 tribes to talk about this issue. And we've held it twice since, and then COVID happened. But, one of the things is that we often saw that as sort of an important policy lever to open the door for Native people to participate in this industry. But all that being said, that's sort of my policy work. I've worked in that realm. I've done that stuff. But what really sparked what I'm doing today was this run here. So about a month after the Bears Ears National Monument was reduced, I was invited by a friend who, you see Greg Balkin. He's got a big beard. He's just below me on the left side of the screen. He called me and said, hey, would you like to do this run? We're going to run 6 miles, relay style, 250 miles across Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante. And we're going to do it in 3 days or 2.5 days. And I said, sure. But we came together and basically ran across the length of the 2 monuments to tell this story about why this place is important. But what this really hit home for me was how important this place, Bears Ears, is to not just Native people, but also non-Native folks as well. And also how interesting it is when you work in that sort of space between these two communities. So this is our sort of first entry in working in film. Let's see. So we started making product, and at the time I was learning how to ski. I was learning how to climb. Climbed a bunch of mountains in Colorado, and also began learning about a lot of the conflict and controversy around things like skiing on Dokosli, one of our sacred mountains to 13 tribes in Arizona. And one of the pieces that I think became really clear was just one, there's the number of Native folks sort of in front of the camera doing these sports is fairly limited. But also I began more deeply connecting with where I came from. My grandfather was a traditional healer. And so having a sense of those traditions and learning about the sacred mountains, I began a project in which I began visiting them, first climbing them and then eventually skiing them under my own power. And so this really led to us thinking about movement through landscape as a form of traditional ecological knowledge, but also an important tool in how we tell these stories. And so just, for reference, Connor, who's in this photos, he's Hunkpapa Lakota, and the photographer behind the camera is Ute. But when we just created this mission statement a couple years ago, but it likely will change, and it'll change with us. But we have a very simple mission, and this allows us to basically have a lot of latitude in what we're doing, but it also allows us to sort of guide our decisions about what sorts of projects we take and what we don't, and the things we pursue. And these sorts of guiding values are really important in terms of sort of understanding where the opportunity is, but also kind of when to say no. But when we do storytelling, it's fairly simple. We think about human-powered movement. This is running, skiing, just using the power of the human body as a centerpiece of our storytelling. We really value looking at cultural relationships to the natural world, not just of Native folks, but of non-Native folks as well, all the people that spend time in these places. Because there's, I think of a Venn diagram, there's always that sort of center point where there is an overlap. And in those overlaps, there's a lot of opportunity to build shared narratives and things that can inspire vast groups of people. And the last is that, we try to tell stories that are complex. We don't try to say this is good, this is bad, but we try to present the whole breadth of, this is the complexity of this issue. Make the decision for yourself. And you'll see with a lot of that work, it's been focused a lot on climate change recently. So yeah, we've done, this is one of our first projects where we spent some time down here in Tucson, Arizona. There's this place called Cochise Stronghold. It's an incredible place. It's got these huge 1,000-foot granite domes and this neon green lichen all over it. It's an incredible place. But this was one of the first sort of adventure projects that I worked on. And it was with a half native, half non-native crew. But we wanted to spend time here and talk about this place and what it meant to the Chiricahua Apache people. Basically a high-level story is that a group of Apaches outran the U.S. cavalry for 9 months in this area. In large part, it was because of climbing and being able to move and knowing the landscape. And we wanted to recreate and tell that story. One, to keep that connection alive to this area, but also to educate non-native climbers who spend a lot of time in this area. So Aaron, who you see on the wall there, is actually from Kayenta, Arizona. He's a climbing guide down here in Tucson, but he's also one of our athletes at Natives Outdoors. Very talented man. The second story that I kind of alluded to before is kind of the work that we've been doing in the skiing and snow sports industry. But as many of you are aware, especially if you're from in Arizona, you might be aware of the controversy around snowball and the use of artificial snow made from sewage to basically support that ski resort. And what underlies that and what sort of is the story, and that as someone that comes from policy and energy, is that it's climate change. There's snow seasons are shortening, and that means that snowpacks aren't sticking around as long. And for ski areas, this is kind of an issue. But one of the things is that environmentally, this is an issue as well too, because these snowpacks hold our water that melt off and basically flow down in the spring. So back in 2019, we decided to do a winter ascent of this mountain in basically one of the deepest snow years on record. And in part, the reason why we wanted to do this is we basically climbed and skied off this mountain, but we did this because the climate projections show for that this mountain by 2050, 2060, somewhere by mid-century, Doko-Slid, this mountain, will no longer have a year-round snowpack. And it's basically what climate scientists call a snow drought. And since this was one of the deepest years on record, we wanted to show what this place looked like so future generations could see. But one of the other things is that we really wanted to just help educate the snow community about the issues that are happening around here. So you can read this, it's online, but this was part of a larger project that I did around visiting all 4 of our sacred peaks. But the other project that I'd say really sort of skyrocketed us into working into filmmaking was this project called Welcome to Gwich'eajre. One second. This project, I mentioned before, I worked with the Department of Energy, and that work took me to interior Alaska, to Arctic Alaska a lot. We were working with a lot of Native peoples up there. In interior Alaska, they're Athabascan speakers, just like us Navajo. And it's kind of funny, there's a lot of words that are similar. You go there, it kind of reminded me of going to Shiprock. It was just a little colder, and instead of eating sheep, they ate moose. But they're facing some environmental issues up there as well, with specifically around the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge being open for oil and gas development. This is a direct threat to the Gwich'in people's identity, the porcupine caribou herd that they rely on. And so we made a short film tying the story of Bears Ears and the Arctic Refuge together through this film. And you can watch this online. But I think one of the things that really was pretty eye-opening from this experience was just how far well-made films that have powerful stories can go. And I saw this as an incredibly powerful tool for sort of shaping the narrative of Native peoples in these spaces. But that film eventually landed on, through distribution networks, ended up on Congressman Grijalva's office, who's the representative here in Tucson. And I was invited to come speak about the issues of beer land management policymaking in Alaska and stuff like that. But the film was central to shaping that narrative. So I'm going to take a deeper dive into 2 more stories, and then I'll get to share the films that we've made, both commercial. You'll see some of that, and then also some of the more documentary work that we've done as well. But these are the next 2 stories are actually about things I've done this past year. And this is kind of where, much of my work recently has been focused in the Southwest and telling those stories. And I've been slowly branching out to doing other work in other regions. So this mountain is Siksika. It's a sacred peak to the Warm Springs tribes in Oregon. This is also known as Mount Jefferson. I believe it's the highest peak or second highest peak in Oregon. But one of the important things to note is that this is an old volcano. It's a part of this range called the Cascades. And I'll show you about what that means here in a second. But an incredibly beautiful place. So last year, there was incredibly large fires in Oregon. And the fires were basically largest on record. And this is pretty significant for Oregon because of where it burned. So if you look on the map, you kind of see on the right side of the map that it looks kind of like a desert. It's brown. There's not a lot of green vegetation. And as you move to the left, it becomes more green. And that's because of this mountain range that runs through the center of the state and through the Pacific Northwest called the Cascades. You see Mount Hood there. And just below that tag that says the Lion's Head Fire, that's at Siksika Mount Jefferson. That's that mountain that we climbed. But this Cascade range, basically, the Pacific Ocean's not far away, but these storms will come off the Pacific. And what will happen is that they'll basically stop at that mountain range. And all of that rain and water is dumped on the western slopes of the mountain. But what that means is that, this side of the mountain, the west side of the mountain is incredibly lush, like rainforest, mosses, huge trees, and also just a ton of water. And often it's very rare for these places to burn. On the right side of this range is the desert. In Oregon, a lot of people kind of believe that, most of the fires happen on the desert side, on the dry side of the Cascades. But what happened in 2020 was this fire, the Lion's Head fire, was started by lightning. And in the course of about 2 weeks, it burned somewhere up in basically 2 weeks in Oregon, close to 500,000 acres was burned. But the Lion's Head fire burned through this rainforest, not just, burned the tops or whatever, but basically scorched everything to the ground. But this is an effect of climate change. Fires are changing, droughts are getting more intense, and these fires are getting larger. This is the photo of what that fire looked like when it started. And we actually went to where the lightning struck, about approximately where it struck. But this fire ripped around and went onto the Cascades Range. The important thing to note is that the trees out here are massive. This is not one of the largest trees. This was just a tree that was on the trail we were walking on. But in the Pacific Northwest, there's these things called nurse logs. And nurse logs are logs like this that fall over and begin to rot and deteriorate. But what it does is it creates a ecosystem for fungi, other plants, and even animals to live. And so you can kind of imagine a wet sponge. That's kind of the consistency of what these things can look like. But even those burned in this fire, which kind of shows you the intensity of the drought, but also the intensity of the fire. And so what we were doing was wanting to basically walk the dividing line of this Cascade Range to see the impacts of this fire, but also kind of trying to tell the story about how climate change is changing these landscapes. So we have our skis on our back. And I think one of the important things to note about a lot of these human-powered adventures is that you're walking a lot. But the fire started right on this ridge over here. And you can kind of see how dry it is. It was blowing dust that day. It was an incredibly eye-opening sight. But, you can, again, a lot of walking. But we're walking through an existing burn area. This was an area that burned maybe about 30 years ago, again, on the dry side of the Cascades. But our objective and where we're headed is that peak up there. It was probably about a 27-mile round trip walk with about 10,000 feet of vertical gain. So it was a lot. And, we're carrying our tents and our sleeping bags and everything on our backs on the way in. So this is what it looks like to snow camp. You make water from the snow around you. You don't have to carry much water in, but it means that if you don't, you have to have fuel on you, which I ran out of halfway through. And so it became kind of interesting. But on the first day, we ended up camping here and then making our summit push the next. So as we started walking closer, we could begin to see as we're near the sort of center point of the Cascade Range here. And on each side, it was very stark. On the west, you can see how green it is. And on the east, you can see how dry it is. It was I have never seen that sort of starkness in landscape. But of course, since we walked up, we have to come down. And this is a friend of mine that I've made. His name's Forrest. He's a Patagonia snowboarder. Much better on camera snowboarding than I am. But, of course, this is one of the amazing things of spending time in these places is just seeing how incredible they are. But this kind of gives you an example of what these winds look like on this ridge. We kind of thought this looked like a wave, but it's basically the moisture content of the snow is so much that basically it'll start forming these crazy features from wind and moisture and whatever on the sort of high points of these places. And then of course, coming down through the burn area, this is me skiing with my cowboy hat on back, but kind of showing you what the burn area looked like. One of the things is that even when fires rip through places like this, the fires will actually change the snowpacks later in the year, meaning there's less tree cover, so it's a lot easier for the snow to melt off quickly when there's sun. And this is something that we have to consider with a changing climate, is that snowpacks may not stick around as long because of factors like this. But again, a lot of walking and a lot of trudging through, places like this. You can see the burnt log, but at many points we were not skiing. And the last, this is very much related. So about a month and a half, 2 months ago, I got to spend time on this place called the Yampa River. And, what's the connection between the river and, snowpacks in the mountains is that all of the water, all of the water that is in the snowpacks eventually flows into our rivers. So the snow that falls in Colorado and places further north directly impacts me here living in Tucson, Arizona, because about 80% of our water comes from this river. The Yampa is one of the tributaries that flows into the Colorado. It's also the longest undammed section of the Colorado in the state, or the longest undammed river in the state of Colorado. And the important thing to note is that, what we've been seeing in the past 20 years in the Southwest and the West is that there's been decreasing snowpacks, and this is directly related to climate change, but year after year after year it begins accumulating. And and you can directly see this in the river. So I kind of been going on this journey downstream from the snowpacks to now the rivers and telling these stories as well. So I mentioned that it was a slow snow year. The dark blue line, although it kind of on the bottom, is the snowpack for the headwaters of the Yampa River. You can kind of see that it's fairly low, but I think an important thing to note is that this has been basically we've had about 5 to 6 years in the last decade of where this has been basically below average snowpacks. And these effects accumulate. It takes a long time. After a bad snow year, it takes many years for there to be a recovery, if ever. And what we're seeing more and more now is that the landscapes that we're on are permanently changing. They're not going to return to where they're at. So at least in terms of thinking about this river flow, it's going to be much lower average than it has been in the past. So this is kind of what that looks like. You can see on the left, that's the that's the Yampa River where it meets and converges with the Snake River. It was pretty crazy. We put in on so just for reference, normally this time of year, the river flows at about 330 cubic feet per second, which doesn't mean much, but it's enough in terms of like being able to float down the river. It's usually enough if you have a small raft. This year, when we put in, it was at 30 CFS, which is about 10% of what it should be. So 10% of the normal flow was flowing down this river this time of year. And what we wanted to document is, was this river going to run dry before our eyes? So this section of river of the Yampa, we put in this place called Deer Lodge, and our objective was to get to this place called Echo Park. It's about 50 miles. And normally on a river trip, you can do that in 2 to 3, probably 3 days normally in normal river flows. In this case, it took us about 7. And this is why. So we began walking. This is day 1, but we began walking down the river. And as you can see here, it was dry, incredibly dry. There was enough water to float in certain areas, but you would eventually, go 10 feet and get stopped by a band of rocks. And we did this for about 12 miles the first day. I think we were moving at about it, and we went 10 miles the first day in 12 hours. So we were moving at less than 1 mile an hour, if that gives you a sense. We might have, crawling might have been faster. But we really wanted to share how this place is changing and what's occurring. We were the only people down there, believe it or not. The impacts aren't just on our water supply, of course, but also, animals rely on this. And we got to see these bighorn sheep. We got within, 20 feet of them. And, some of them these ones are actually looking fairly healthy, but there was a number of others that were not. And this was important for us to share this story. And on the third day, we wanted to see, was like, well, rafting is moving way too slow. Is there a faster way to do this? So we put everything on our back. Our packs were about 60 pounds, pretty awkward. It was really hot. I think it was in the low 90s, and we tried walking, but we moved faster. But it meant that we were having to, basically walk through things like poison ivy, rock beds like this. It just wasn't working. And so we said, well, we tried, we're going to go back to our rafts. And of course, a ton of walking through here. So I think the really cool thing about the Yampa is that if you see this photo here, we actually got a photo of what this looks like from above. But you can see that the water for this river effectively right here just disappeared into the sand. And we walked sections like this for miles. But we were right here in this section here. That giant wall that was in front of me here is on the left side of the screen here, and that's the turn in the river. This was taken a few days before we put in, and it looks like there's water down there, but it got way lower. But it was really an amazing experience to be the only people in this canyon. And then towards the end, the sand disappeared and the river began to reappear. But this is kind of what is known as the largest rapid on the river. It's called the Warm Springs Rapid. Normally, in normal water years, this water is about 10 feet higher. And but we still had a little fun, got to get in the water, and then I got to get dumped in the river, of course. And I think the important thing to note is that we were exhausted. This was our last camp before pulling out. And this story I'll share in the links, but this just got published on National Geographic. But the important thing to note is just it was a really hard experience. It was really challenging, but I think one of the things that we came out of it is that people need to know how our world is changing and the ways in which climate change is affecting these places. Okay, so let me share. Got that video. Let me share with you the films that we have going on, and then I can share about if some of you are interested. We got some commercial work too that as I like to say, pays the bills. So this is a film I kind of mentioned. You saw Connor at the beginning, but Connor is one of our ski athletes. He's from Papua Lakota. He's now a sponsored athlete for Patagonia. But we've been working on this past year about trying to tell this story about southwestern Colorado and the Ute people's connection to the mountains there. And so this story is about Connor spending time to go meet with a number of Ute folks and spend time with them in the mountains. But I'll share with you the first 2 minutes of the introduction of the film, and then I'll share the last sort of ending sequence of the movie. But I think one of the cool things about this is that it was a Native crew that filmed it. And so this film is going to be debuting in a film festival in Canada next month. But I'm really excited to share with you what this looks like now.
Everybody ready? All right, okay. Here we go. I mean, there's a sense that like a mountain is more than just a conglomeration of geological features. I'm not just going out into empty space. There's a personality to each of these places. There's a spirit to each of these peaks. We have a relationship, and I think perceiving the mountains as entities and beings of their own, like, it makes that even harder. Because it feels like there's someone that you're letting down. And it just makes me wonder, like, what do I owe to them as I'm having that experience? I always have that feeling that like the place is perceiving me as well. And so I want it to know this is what I'm here for. I'm here to make myself better so that I can show up for my family, for my community, for all my relations.
All right, let me just pause that and then I'll show you the ending of this as well. But this film will be available online, and if you follow our social, you'll definitely see it on there. All right, so this is the ending of the film. So Connor goes and spends time with a number of Ute folks, actually skiing with a number of them, but talking about some of the impacts that have happened in the San Juan Mountains, like the Gold King mine spill, and just other things that have affected this place. But one of the big things that came away, sort of one of the thesis of the films is the importance of water in the ways in which we're connected to all living things through water. And the Lakota have this concept called Mitakiyasin, which I guess in terms of Navajo concepts, it's most related to the idea of and how we're related to all things around us. So when he talks about Mitakiyasin, that's sort of the reference there, and he's talking about it through the lens of water.
Well, yeah. You can't really not live in Mitakiyasin. Wherever you're at the center. Everything that put you there, everything that got you there comes from like this really intricate web of relations. No matter what you do, you're always a part of that. But on top of the mountain, there's just this very visceral feeling of connection. 3, 2, 1. Way in all these directions, and the water you're standing on right there could go to this river basin this way or this river basin that way. The trees, the birds, the animals, all that. As soon as you're here, you're related to them too. If that's something that we can all learn how to do better, we all benefit from it, right? Like we're all my relations. Sacred to us for some mysterious reason. The reason they're sacred to us is because they give us life. And now that you're here, they give you life too.
So that's going to be coming out here in the next month or so, and then so that's kind of our storytelling project. I wouldn't call that our commercial work. That's sort of the things that we like to do, but sort of the flip side of it is that it also means that we have to do other sorts of commercial projects, and we've worked with a couple so far. I'll show you two short trailers. One's for a car commercial for REI and the Ford Bronco. But we got to ride some bikes and do some stuff for that. But then the other is there's a company in Colorado called Fat Tire. They're like the first carbon neutral certified beer in the United States. And we've been working with them on a couple of things. One of them is also like finding carbon sequestration projects that benefit Native communities, but also on some of their storytelling as well. So I'll share two of those, and they're fairly short.
riding this route called the Sky Islands Odyssey. It's 220 miles and about 15,000 feet of elevation gain. Oh wow, bustling. I think it's like these sorts of adventures when I'm halfway through and I question why I'm doing this. One of the hardest things I've ever done.
So a little sizzle reel right there, and then the last one is this is for we worked with another film company on this one, but we were talent, and then also did a number of the drone work in it as well. So little sizzle reel, and then the last one that we're working on right now is with this state of Idaho's tourism board, and so we're working on some artist profiles for them, and this has been a really fun project. Commercial at the end of the day, because we are working for the state of Idaho and their tourism board, but we got to be able to share a number of Native artists' stories through the state. So this is that and breadth of the work that we've been doing.
Most of the paintings kind of represent me. So a lot of my work is a medicine in a way. If I'm having a bad time or I'm thinking too much, painting's the only way that I can get myself together. Little wheel spin and spin, big wheel turn around and around. Little wheel spin and spin, big wheels turn around and around. I put a lot of emotion into my work and discovering of myself, of who I am. I considered myself non-binary. I had my own two-spirit community, and we had a hard time to express ourselves, and that was wrong for the longest time. My painting feels like bringing good medicine, and this is how I can show I heal. Little wheel spin and spin, big wheel turn around and around. Little wheel spin and spin, big wheels turn around and around. Little wheel spin and spin, big wheel turn around and around.
So there it is. We kind of, the film stuff has taken off quite a bit in the last year, but we've been trying to balance the work that we do with the commercial, but also trying to do important work like that. So but yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Question in chat that says, through your storytelling and experience with the government work, do you see a common pattern of protected lands being downsized to exploit natural resources, or lobbyists behind these downsizing efforts?
I think it depends on where it's at. I mean, definitely with the last administration, there was a lot of folks that were from oil and gas industries that were there. I would also highlight there was a lot of Native people that worked in oil and gas industries that were pushing some of these policies. So like the coin, the knife cuts two ways. And I think one of the things is that, policies change, but what can help inform and sort of drive dialogue around it is storytelling like that. If people get informed, feel inspired, that can lead to them calling senators and putting pressure on, things that are happening to not happen, right? And I think that's been one of the things that we've been really excited to work on was just projects like that. One of the ones I didn't share that we did actually last year was that we did a number of voting videos with the Rural Utah Project in like turning out the native vote. Some of you might have seen it online, but there was a number of videos of Native people talking about why voting mattered to them. And so that was another sort of project that we did that we, I don't know, tried to change that dialogue. But I think one of the things is that social media and organizing and those things can go a long way, especially in terms of amplifying and advocating for these issues that, you know, impact our ancestral homelands. Chelsea has her hand up.
Yep. Hi, Len.
Hey.
Thank you for all of the info, and also to Change Labs for having you on. I was just interested in what kind of protocols you or your procedures you take culturally when you go to all these places, not only as a Native Navajo person, but also as like these places are in different Native countries and nations, and what kind of, like, what do you do before you go to a place, or if anything?
Yeah, I think it depends. I mean, with the Ute film that we made, like that was made in conjunction with, we had an advisory council of folks from the Ute tribe. So like they were basically centerpiece of that storytelling. And, you know, it's kind of one of those, yeah, it's kind of always a balance, because sometimes like too many cooks in the kitchen can really slow things down. But, you know, in terms of building those partnerships on that end, that's something that we do. And with those Idaho videos, for example, you know, that was something that the tribes basically asked for. And so we worked very directly with them and also the state of Idaho to kind of tell stories that the tribes wanted to tell. And I think one of the important things, at least in that particular instance, is that the state of Idaho and the number of their tribes do not have a good relationship on a lot of issues. And when we kind of stepped into that, we were kind of like a little bit of tribal liaison, a little bit. But, you know, I think one of the things that was, so they had creative control over that, of how those things are presented, and the artists did too. And that's kind of different from a lot of commercial projects, is that often it's like, you're in, you're out, you take the footage, and then you do all the editing, and the talent often doesn't get a whole lot of say. But this is like this is not just Native context either. But there's that. But you know, when visiting the mountains, you know, where possible, try to get permission. And you know, if there's controversies around doing certain things on a certain area, I generally won't go. You know, Great Bears Lodge, Devil's Tower in Wyoming, I will never climb because of the issues around it. But, you know, the other is on, you know, at least on the Navajo side, I kind of mentioned I went and climbed and skied the Four Sacred Mountains. And part of that was just to get more deeply connected with the ceremonial, the songs and ceremonies surrounding those. And so I've learned a number of the songs through that project. And I think it was kind of one of those things where it's like my family hated skiers and hated skiing and hated climbing, but I wouldn't have learned those songs about the mountains had I not done those things. And so that's, you know, at least when I go, you know, of course, place an offering, do that. And I do that in the other places I go to as well. But that's generally the protocol. I just don't try to do things to do them. I try to do them with intention. And then Joseph has a question.
Thank you for the information. I'm really happy that Change Labs really exposes a lot of the entrepreneurs that they're helping to people like yourself. I think it's really important that we see really great examples of people that are very active in doing a number of different things. And what I'm working on right now, I left the industry of banking to come back home to the res. I'm in Kayenta right now, and I'm really passionate about the water issues that you kind of touched on, the crisis that we're in right now, and I'm really working on trying to do something about it. And my question is, how, when you left like the security of the government, I guess, jobs that you had, to going into being independent. I'm going through that process right now, and it's kind of scary. I don't have that financial support that I loved having, but I'm pursuing, I guess, a field that I'm passionate about, that I'm just starting to build upon. What kind of message, or what kind of I guess, tips do you have for us to kind of keep in the back of our mind? Because I'm sure some of us might, if things are not panning out the way we wanted to, we might want to give up, but then we know that there's an opportunity here to do something great.
Yeah, that's such a, I mean, I still deal with that every day, that uncertainty. So it doesn't ever go away, I guess this is the point. But, I would say in terms of how did I balance that, was, like stable, well-paying job, working 9 to 5. It also meant that, like, for my side hustle, starting the company, I was working another 2 to 3, 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours outside of that. And I worked too much. I mean, that was a thing that I didn't take care of myself, I guess is a good way to put it, as I just worked too much. And that was a trade-off I made, is that I had this steady job and I used that to basically finance the other thing. That's one of the approaches I took. And then when it felt like it was at a point where I could take the leap, I did. But it doesn't always work like that. And I think the important thing is, like, being able to, there's long hours for sure. It's a lot of working, and sometimes it doesn't seem like there's going to be a reward, but if you stick with it, often you can make something happen if you stick with it long enough. And, I think that's especially in the sort of trajectory that we've had, there's just so much uncertainty. We don't know. I mean, we're pitching projects right now to clients, or not to potential clients, and also current clients. And, like, none of there's a high failure rate for those pitches. I think for every 10 I pitched, we might get a partial yes on one. And that's one of the things is, like, I think the process of being creative and trying to find those new avenues can be really scary. But, I think especially if someone's not doing it already, it means that there's an opportunity there. And you shouldn't look at it like kind of in the lens of, like, this isn't worth, no one's doing it because it's not worth it. If you think that there's a chance there probably is. That's a big piece of it. I think the other thing that's really helped with reducing this sort of scariness and uncertainty around it is exactly kind of it seems like what Change Lab is doing is building a community of entrepreneurs and folks that are doing really good work, and having that network of folks that you can always sort of, call, chime into, bounce ideas off of, talk about how scary it is, being out in the world of professional hunting and gathering, as I call it. But it never goes away. But I think, I always kind of look at it as, especially with some of these projects, it's like, okay, I made enough to pay rent for 3 months. So, I have 3 months to, shovel more water out of my boat before it sinks. It kind of feels like that some days. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I think that especially the networking and knowing folks, and continuing to just at least put, even if it feels like small steps, I think today, like, if I look at what are my tasks today, I made a pitch deck for a company, and that was I'll share you what that, actually, I'll just share you what that looks like. So you can kind of see on our end, we're pitching a project to, this company called Onyx. They make like a app, but they're wanting to do more stuff with sort of native focused stories in sort of native tribal right or treaty rights issues. So this is what a story deck kind of looks, or a pitch deck generally looks like. I call it giving it the companies the razzle dazzle. It's a really good looking, sort of like really curated photos, but we're doing two things. We're making an interactive map and we're going to be having it focused on tribal off-reservation hunting rights in tribal treaties. And so we talk about, this was the Ute example, but there's this area in Colorado in which the Ute tribes can issue hunting tags on federal and state lands in the state, and it's forced the tribes in the state to work together. But we're going to say, hey, we're going to do this thing, and then we're also going to do a short film, but super high level. Again, giving them sort of the high level concepts of what this looks like visually. A mood board is what we call this, but kind of showing what the film might look like. And these will often change. And, just the high level pieces there. And then, showing the deliverables. And so this was like my project today. So this kind of gives you, I have a whole spreadsheet that kind of breaks this out. But, it depends. This is always, especially if you're freelancing, this, you can kind of see the numbers there. They're high. And even for me, these are kind of crazy numbers. But it's always this sort of game, especially if you're contracting, is that you have to know what others are charging in industry. Because what we found pretty early on is that we were way undercharging for a lot of the projects that we were doing. And that's a double-edged sword. It means that you get a lot of work, but often it means that you don't have enough time to do a good job on the projects that you're doing. So we've raised our rates and more in line with what sort of is industry standard, and learned how to budget better. And this is always, I call it dancing with, the client, is that they won't tell you how much they're willing to pay, but they have a number in mind and you're kind of guessing at what it should be. And you have to take signals and cues on what, it's just weird. It's a weird game, but this is sort of our first proposed budget. We have the writing and research. You can see how much that is per hour. I think the important thing to note about that hourly rate is like most hourly rate, this seems kind of high, but the sort of dance that you have to play is that this is not an hourly job that you're working and going to every day. This is basically it's a little bit less than a week's worth of work for that first part of it. And this job may never come again. And so there's an understanding within industry that you can charge a lot higher for those sorts of rates. And an important thing to note is that if you're going and freelancing or doing that sort of work, it's just important to have your rate sheet and how much you charge on these sorts of projects. Let me get out of this. But that's an important thing that I'm still learning. And I don't know. I still don't know that side of it. And so I have to go talk to people. And, I just bounced this off someone and he said, that's a little high, but it might work. We don't know. We've never worked with this client before. But I think especially on that end, a big thing is know your worth and not being and also being able to say no to a project where you don't think you're getting paid enough. That's one of the things that I learned is I was taking everything I could get, which at an early stage, and if you're kind of in that early stage of starting a business is important. It's just like getting your name out there, doing something for, you're not getting paid in as much as you want, but you're building a portfolio. And that's kind of where that trade-off comes, is that, you're investing in building the quality of work that you do and being able to point to when you go to future clients and say, hey, I've done this before, I've done that before. And then you can charge the higher rate. And that's kind of where we're in that transition phase of moving from just taking anything to being able to say, oh, we can pick and choose now. But I think that's kind of, we don't know. We're still figuring it out. And I have people that have been in the industry, very talented people that are very successful, 10, 15 years in, that tell me the same thing. They're like, we don't know. It just it's year to year. So I guess that would be my long-winded answer of that's kind of how I would approach that sort of work. But happy to, if you want to reach out afterwards, I'm happy to have a conversation more about what that looks like. Someone said, do people reach out to you and your company, or does your company initially make the first connection? I would say when we started early, we were pitching we were going around making connections, just taking whatever we could get to build that portfolio. Now we're in a position where a lot of people are coming to us, and it's having to basically we just have to be very deliberate about what we do, because sometimes it's like some people want things done for really cheap and it's just like not worth our time, because it's if you take on too much, it just becomes overwhelming. And so we just try to basically say, does this align with our mission and values? Are we getting compensated fairly so that we're not having to like basically scrape it, overwork ourselves? And two, is this a company that we want to work with? And now we've actually we're reaching out to companies more directly now. So that REI film, for example, we reached out to them and they said yes, which felt crazy when it happened, but it's a mix. And I would say, most times the answer is no, or, I would say like we probably get yes 5 or 10% of the time. So being able to handle rejection is a really big, picking yourself up and then doing it again. It's kind of a process for sure. The second question, what types of tools and apps should a beginner have who wants to experiment, or someone who wants to get started? I'm assuming this might be for filmmaking, or that sort of thing. Quite honestly, like smartphones, is that right? Oh yeah, so it is for filmmaking. But one of the things to note is that filmmaking, your phone. I mean, believe it or not, like a lot of newer phones have film quality, cinema quality 4K, for example, and you can do quite a lot there. And iMovie, for example, on iPhones is a really good film editing app, and there's a lot of YouTube tutorials. So in my work, when I say I produce films, I like to say I'm the glorified businessman and party planner. I help a little bit with the filming, I help a little bit with the edit, but my main role is actually putting all the pieces together, the people, the characters, the flights, the travel, the financing, that sort of thing. And that's kind of where my role as a producer and director comes in. A director is someone that actually sort of guides how a piece feels and feels stylistically. So I've kind of taken along on those different roles. And one of the things I've been learning recently is how to operate a camera, believe it or not. But the main thing is, especially in these large scale films, is that one of the things, at least in Natives Outdoors, is that we have about 9 to 10 people that we work with on a contract basis. And for all of those folks, they all bring different skills to the table. Not every person can do every one thing, but together as a team, that's where we can sort of support each other. And, especially with projects like that, we can pull a team together that can do it. And that's kind of important, is that especially if you're looking at a business or something, is the work that you're doing, is there an opportunity to collaborate or partner with other people? Because working together, I've learned, has been key, at least in doing some of the bigger stuff. And then got one more question from Joseph, but favorite inspirational book. I read a lot of history books. There's a really good book called The Other Slavery. It's actually very much related to our history in the Southwest. But I read a lot and just learn about the places that we spend time. And yeah, I've been really and that's been sort of inspiring to a lot of the projects. I read a lot of environmentally focused books. I mean, that's just sort of the nature of the work that I'm in. I think is that all the questions we have? I'm happy to answer any more. Awesome. Well, that being said, I mean, I think, I'm on social media and happy to, if any of you are starting a business or have questions, if you're doing freelancing or media work, I'm happy to share what I've learned, because, one of the things I've learned in the filmmaking world is people don't talk about, they don't share knowledge. They don't share these experiences. And especially for Native folks getting into this space, that's such a huge barrier. It's like, it becomes impossible, because it means that you don't know what you don't know. And I think that's been something that I think from this, like, that's why I did the session, but also like why I'm happy to share those experiences in the future too.
I had a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so getting into any business, small business, what were your barriers as far as getting a business license through your tribe? I just kind of tuned in at the last minute, and so I just kind of curious about that one.
Yeah, so you know what? We actually didn't start on Navajo Nation in part because it's so hard comparatively. But that's also because we were in the state of Colorado. We started there. And so we started a corporation there. And that's, that down the road, we plan to incorporate on Navajo Nation, but it just we haven't gotten around to it. And it didn't make sense at the time because it was like, I was on a plane flight and I was like, I'm going to do this. And yeah, I would say that was I haven't started a business on Navajo Nation, but from the folks that I know, it can be challenging, especially if there's brick and mortar sort of operations. But there's other people that know more about that than me, but I'll defer to that. But I would say in terms of starting a business, there's a lot of challenges, but I would say the top two, networking, knowing the people in the spaces that you're working in, getting connected with them, having your name on their radar is like, it's mission critical. But it's also really hard because it means I'm talking about my experience in the film world, but it means I'm interacting in a world where it's largely white, largely male, and largely folks that have no idea about who Native people are. And it means having really weird conversations, biting my tongue a lot, and just kind of playing the game in weird ways and just saying like, is this worth, like being frustrated about it, throwing my hands up. That's one. But, I think that was persistence. But I think the big thing that I found that was helpful there is really making friends with folks that believe in you and are willing to advocate for you. So I'm finding those mentors. A lot of my mentors on the film side have been non-Native. And that's been, sort of navigating cultural differences is always a challenge. But it also means that, it creates really cool friendships as well. That trip that I did on the river, for example, that I shared was with a Nat Geo photographer named Peter McBride. And that wouldn't have happened had I not sort of invested in that friendship. That goes a long way. The second one, I would say more nuts and bolts, is the financing part of it. On the film and apparel and product, we made products and that sort of thing. But that one, both of those, the biggest hurdle is financing, money. Like it's expensive. It requires a lot of upfront investment. I have a little bit of sense of financial wherewithal, but it means that I was putting it on credit cards. I do not recommend doing that. Low interest business loans are the way to go. But, I was like, I don't know what I'm doing, but I have access to money, fake money. So I'm going to use this monopoly money to go try to make real money. Learning that system is really important. And so, for example, our camera setup that we had this past year, that was when I really learned, like, we're taking a big risk now, because, before it was like $5,000 here for 20,000 products, right? And we'd sell those. It makes sense, like doing that sort of thing. But for the camera side, it's like we spent $35,000 total on that camera setup and drones and all these other things. And it was just like, I was looking at the business credit card balance of like, I don't know how we're ever going to pay this off. This is crazy. What am I doing? But, one of the things is that I was why we made that choice and why we made that risk is a few things. Is that we have three folks, I've made a film before, it was successful. We were working with Isaiah and Connor, who have worked on films before. The three of us have enough experience and connections where it's like, okay, this risk makes enough sense to take because we can do these sort of projects like we shared there. And I think that's kind of where, in a certain degree, being an entrepreneur is also meaning taking financial risks as well, but informed financial risks is key, is understanding that this is a big step. It might feel scary, but trusting that there's enough on the other end to make it happen. That's kind of where we did the film thing. And, the camera's paid off now, but at the time it's really scary. And I think especially that sort of mentorship on that financial risk taking is something that I'm still figuring out, but I'm seeking others as well. But I think, that's a huge one. And it depends on the business. It depends on the industry. The consulting work that I do, for example, that's not much of a financial risk. It's like, it's just my time. Right. So. So don't do what I did. Is my point.
Okay. We're about out of time.
Okay.
But there is one more question. I don't know if we can quickly answer that.
Yeah.
What strategies? Yeah, go ahead.
What strategies do you create storylines? Generally, like what I find is if there's people, I like to have stories that connect to the past and the future through people living today. So that the story about the ski film that I shared with you with Connor, a Hunkpapa Lakota man spending time in southwestern Colorado on Ute land. And there's a history of why that land came to be. And then there's the future, which is, Native peoplers are going to continue to be here. So let's write this story together. It's like that sort of piece that can tie that deep history, current experience, and the future is generally where we try to land.
Thank you, Dr. Necefer, for the presentation. It's fun learning about a lot of new things. And I want to thank everyone for attending. Again, my name is Marcia Gray Eyes. If you'd like to reach out, you can email me at marcia@nativestartup.org. Again, we are hiring community advocate, communications, and brand manager. If you're interested, please visit our website at nativestartup.org/jobs. And join us next week for how to legally protect your Native artwork. And it's presented by ASU's Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. We hope to see you there. And bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.